very few people know about, right, which is I was actually a professional chef, right, for 10 years after the UFC.
I thought about that. I just had one guy on as a boxer.
Did you?
Yeah.
A real boxer or an amateur old guy like me who's
not
who's
an amateur
still
old guy, younger guy. I think he's 25. He boxed, but I think he's stopped now. He was on, and he teaches here. He has a little class here. He teaches boxing.
You're not talking about Cobra Suwa,
Cobra Suwa,
or
yeah.
Lerner, who's also now a member here.
Michael
Lerner.
Cobra Suwa. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
That's
okay.
right.
He's a good friend of mine. He's actually was one of my trainers for executive
That's
fight.
right, right. He said some things that really made me feel very, very good about boxing that I hadn't thought of. He said, it's about not getting hit.
Yeah.
Let the other guy wear himself out, but don't get hit. Learn to be evasive. Stay away from him. Stay away, stay away. And I said, that makes sense because the great boxers have done that. Mayweather, Muhammad Ali, they were difficult to hit. But some of the other people like Smoke and Joe just came in, didn't care if you hit them, or Tyson. Yeah. They were about hitting you. They went on the attack all the time.
Right.
So it wasn't so much boxing as it was, just let me take this guy out.
That's right. It's hit and don't get hit, right, is the mantra of all the great boxers, right?
That's right. Don't you think so? But don't get hit.
Hit and don't get hit.
That's right. That's right.
On the other hand, it's easy to say, it's very, very hard to do. And actually, from a fan's perspective, if you had to choose between watching two very offensively minded boxers or two more defensively minded boxers, I would take the offensively minded boxers any day of the week, just in terms of watchability from a fan's perspective,
of course,
right?
Because it's more entertaining.
Because it's more entertaining. It's it's more fun to watch. You know, I would challenge you to name 3 or 4 even Mayweather fights, who's arguably one of the greatest in history, that were actually enjoyable to watch, and I can't think of that. I can't think of that many, right? So and he's known for his defense and is awfully evasive, and you couldn't touch him. On the other hand, you fell asleep during his fights, right? Okay. So at least as a fan, I fell asleep during his fights. Okay. So I'd rather watch a Pacquiao fight any day. So.
I have to tell you, the person that I'm lucky enough to have right now, you just heard us talking together, is Erik. He's been in Japan for 5 years now. He works for EY, and he is an interesting guy. He's decided to really put his feet down in this country and his fist in other people's faces. So without any further ado, let's talk with Erik. Erik, I'm so happy you're here this morning.
Right.
It really pleases me because actually we met in this room.
We did meet in this room because I was doing a little bit of work over there, and I think you were working as well, and you may have overheard to be talking to some colleagues about executive fight night and getting ready for executive fight night, and then it was after that that you said, hey, that sounds kind of interesting. Why don't you come on my podcast?
Now, I know where you were born, but you should tell everyone where you were born.
I'm from the U.S. Right. I was actually born in New York City, in Manhattan, 34th Street, and grew up in Manhattan, kind of Middle East side near the UN. So I spent the first 18, 20 years of my life in New York City. City boy during the late 60s, early 70s, and then into the 80s. I went to school in Chicago, right, for college.
That's right.
Took a year to travel in Europe while I was still in college. So I spent a year in Paris.
Now let's go, before you go into all of that,
okay.
How many siblings do you have?
I have one younger sibling, Erik Almadrones, who's back in New York now, but he's also himself kind of a world traveler. And
how many years difference?
A little less than 2.
So you guys are very close.
We're very, very close.
Is he married as well?
He's married as well. He's married, and he was in the Philippines for a number of years and met a Filipino woman, and they've been married for 8 to 10 years now.
Now I wanted to ask you, because I'm looking at your ethnicity, and I was trying to think, because people would look at you and they would think, now Filipinos will know. And since you've said that just now, I can see it. But I was thinking American Indian. Okay. You probably get that. You might get a little Hispanic.
Yeah.
Right? Because Filipinos have had every country in the world try to come there, it seems like. Yeah. Are you Filipino?
But yes. If you see my last name, which is Almadrones, it's a Spanish last name, right? And so if you say it with a Spanish accent, right, it sounds, oh, he must be from somewhere in Spain or somehow Latin American. But no, my father was born in the Philippines, grew up and went to college in the Philippines, and then emigrated to the U.S. in 1964. And he married my mother subsequently a few years later, and she's an American from Northeast, from New Jersey, right? So it's a little bit of a combination of, you know.
She's Caucasian?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So it's kind of a cafe con leche combination, if you will. Right?
So how's your family? I mean, how are your mother and father doing now?
My mother's doing great. She's living the retired life in Florida. She's enjoying her retirement, and you know, after having a long career in nursing and nursing research at Sloan Kettering Cancer Hospital in New York. My father unfortunately passed away 5 or 6 years ago, and so he's no longer with us.
How old is he when he passed away?
He was about 76 years old. 76
but they stayed together the whole time?
They separated kind of late in their marriage. So it was, I think, after 25, 26 years that they separated.
Okay, so were you at home when that happened?
No, I was grown up and long gone by then. So, but no, I mean, I had a good relationship with you know, with both of them, both my father and my mother, and I'm still.
Because they were there while you were growing up.
Of course.
Most important years of your life.
Of course, yes. They were around and got us both through college. My brother and I, and then split up subsequent to that. So yeah.
So after Cornell, when you went to Cornell, what did you do after that? Did you start working right away?
So actually, my undergraduate career was at University of Chicago.
Right.
So I was at U of C, and then after that, I'd say I took what I would call a 10-year-ish career detour into something that very few people know about, right? Which is I was actually a professional chef for 10 years after the U of C. So
no, wait. What caused you to do that? When you were growing up, just to know a little bit more about your youth.
Yes.
Were you more academic or were you more sports-minded as a kid?
I was more academic than sports-minded, but I would not rate myself particularly highly on the academic side. I mean, I did well. However, I didn't necessarily always apply myself in the way that my parents would have liked it.
Okay. What were the subjects that you were most interested in?
I was most interested in social sciences. So I had enough credits to graduate with a degree in French literature. I could have gone the history route, which is what I did. Political science, anthropology. So basically, all of the subjects that have no real world application, right? You know, and not many necessary job prospects, you know, afterwards, were the sorts of subjects that I did in school. But I was always a pretty good writer, right? English language writer.
But growing up, Eric, were you talking with your dad a lot, or was it your mom? The people that guided you, or was the counselors? I mean, I'm sure your peer did as well.
Sure. I'd say that my father was probably the dominant guider and inspiration in some ways for me, because he was a guy who came over from the Philippines. He got a scholarship to Wharton, to University of Pennsylvania, to go do his MBA there, and so you know he came over to the U.S. You know was really successful in the U.S. And he, like many Asians emigrating to the U.S., just had a huge emphasis on education and recognized the importance of a good education and the right schools and those sorts of things. And if it weren't for him, I don't know that I would have moved in the direction that I did from an education perspective.
What did he do? What kind of work did he do?
He worked for CBS, so he was in finance, CBS, the broadcasting company. So, you know, he was around during the Walter Cronkite days of CBS, and worked over on 57th Street on the west side where CBS was located at the time. And I think he had a stint also working for Columbia, right? Because CBS also had various record labels as well, the Columbia record label, right? So I know that he did finance there as well. But the career that he ultimately went down was he actually left CBS still in a relatively young age, and of all things, opened up a limousine service in New York City, right? So, you know, he had just this fleet of limousines, right, that we kept in Long Island City in Queens, and he had a limousine service and catered to, you know, obviously a lot of both corporates and.
Did he speak more than one language? Did he speak Tagalog?
Of course, he spoke Tagalog. And he spoke the King's English, is what is the way I describe it, right? So his English was really almost too perfect, like stilted perfect,
Okay.
right, is the way I'd put it.
So he had 2 languages under his belt.
He had 2 languages, and because he grew up in the Philippines and his parents spoke Spanish, he also had a pretty good understanding of Spanish as well, though he didn't speak a whole lot of Spanish.
In his limousine service, how many people did he have working with him? Do you know? If he had a pretty good crew?
Probably at its biggest point, he had 30 to 40 people.
Were they Filipinos?
All different.
All different. Okay, so he didn't have any.
All different. There were a lot of Filipinos, but there were also Egyptians and Africans,
else, right.
Latinos. So there were a lot of people that worked for him.
And he decided to start. So he had that as his main at one time?
That was his main livelihood.
After CBS?
After CBS, and it always surprised me from a career perspective, but he did well for himself, and it allowed him to be really, obviously independent and self-sufficient and own boss and all those things.
How old were you during this time? How old were you during that time?
I was young. I was still in grammar school. So, my dad would arrange for my brother and me to be taken to school in a limousine every day. So all of my classmates, and we went to a school on 84th and Park Avenue, which is a really nice part of nice part of Manhattan. So all of my school kids thought that, oh, this guy must be loaded, right?
Did the drivers get out and say, okay, Eric, and what's your brother's name?
My brother's name was Mark, but okay, no, we almost made a point of, no, can you drop us off just over here a little bit, because we don't want to.
They find out, come on.
But people would see it and had the mistaken impression that we belonged to a certain milieu that we weren't really a part of.
Okay.
Right?
Was your mom working as well during this time?
My mother was working as well. She was originally an oncology nurse for Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York, and then went on to get a master's in public policy and a master's in she had a couple of master's degrees. I know one was in public policy from Columbia, but she ultimately turned into a kind of oncology nursing researcher and specialist, and so. She was in some ways the one who gave me a lot of thinking about public speaking research. She was oftentimes invited to conferences.
So she had to lecture?
She had to lecture. She wrote books. She just had a lot of exposure to sharing her work more publicly.
What age was this when you were starting to be influenced by your mother?
This was probably late 7th grade, 8th grade,
okay.
and then during high school.
Would she ever do any of these practice? Would she practice sometimes in front of you? Have you guys sit down, you and Mark? And
she wouldn't necessarily practice. What I remember very distinctly though was, I mean, she was still working full time, at the time. But I would remember on the weekends, I would see her in her office on her little glass desk, writing up papers, doing term papers, doing research for her presentations, and getting ready for those things. What does it mean? It means I probably ate a little more pizza, right?
But I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you, did you learn to cook because of that, or did your father cook sometimes?
My mother and father were both great cooks.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying.
They were both
great
cooks.
Did they make sure their sons learned some of the culinary skills?
I mean,
just in case they got busy.
I don't think that it was. I don't think that it was anything necessarily intentional on their part, but for sure it rubbed off on both my brother and me.
Did you have a favorite, like when Dad cooked or Mom cooked, and saying, I like it better when Dad makes this or Mom makes?
My mother, despite being American, she made great Philippine food.
She wanted to make sure she kept your dad.
She made great Philippine food, and all of my Filipino aunts actually.
Such as name something.
There's a dish called dinuguan, right? Which many people would not like because it just doesn't look appetizing. It's made with pork and tomatoes and vinegar, kind of hot peppers, and then pig's blood, right? And so the result is this almost a really thick stew with a really dark brown, almost black color, right?
Okay.
And honestly, you look at it and you say, this doesn't look appetizing, right? But it is delicious, right? And I could easily eat dinuguan once or twice a week if it were available to me. So
it must your father had to have taught her how to do this.
That was my father's mother, right? My grandmother.
Well, she lived with you?
She would come over, and she would spend time with us. But it was actually my grandmother's recipe that she taught my mother how to make, and my mother in turn made her own tweaks to it. And as I say, all of my Filipino aunts were always bugging my mom, Lois, please tell me what's your recipe for this, because this is delicious. We don't know how to make. We don't know how to make it as well as you do. So she was actually a really good Philippine cook.
Okay.
And my dad, I think, was similarly good, but he was more of a let me grill the meat, let me boil the lobsters, right? Let me make there's something Philippine food called pancit, which is like a noodles, right, which he's quite good at. But no, they were both really good cooks. Probably in my dad's case, he was a better eater, right, than he was as a chef, and a very, very slow eater. So it wasn't uncommon to see him sitting at the dinner table, honestly, for an hour and a half. And
everybody else is gone?
Everybody else is gone, but he was still on his like 6th crab, right, like picking apart a crab methodically, right, and going through it. So no, his specialty was eating, right, more so than cooking, I think.
That's beautiful. That is so nice. I like I like that. So you and Mark, would you guys get together and have cook-offs? Because you're so close in age, that means you guys had to grow close. You had some of the same friends. Did you have each other's back too?
Had each other's back. My brother Mark never needed any protection, right? Like so, he just.
Did you?
Did I need protection? No, I didn't really need protection either. But my brother Mark is a natural diplomat, a natural leader, and a natural. He just always had a maturity about him that always navigated him away from any sort of trouble, right? And so he was never the guy that needed protection. But of course, we had each other's backs.
You had cook-offs, or did you guys?
Did we have cook-offs? I wouldn't.
I could see you two in the kitchen saying, "Okay, let's make this today." And
I would say whenever there was a special occasion. Sometimes now that I think about it, it was more my responsibility, right, to make the cake for Mom, right, or to make the cake for Dad, and then he would go and do something else. So we had a division of labor in terms of what we did. But he himself is very, very himself an accomplished chef, and actually the woman that he married is an actual chef. So there's a lot of kind of food elements, right?
Which takes us back to when you took your hiatus.
During my summers during college, I did a couple of things. One, I tried to be a commercial fisherman. My parents had a house in Eastern Long Island, out near Montauk in East Hampton. And I had a friend who had a boat, and at the time, and even today, cost of tuna and prices of tuna were really, really high, of course. So me and my friend who had the boat would oftentimes go out, had a few really good nights of catching 18, 20 tunas, with kind of traditional, big tackle, and then sell the tuna, to local restaurants and to brokers and dealers, some of which, ultimately made its way back to Japan. That was one job that we did for a while. But then my other job, when I wasn't doing that, or I wasn't making enough money doing that, was cooking. So you might know of a chef who's really famous now, but her name is Ina Garten, the Barefoot Contessa, right? You can't miss any of her cookbooks because she's all over, the Food Channel and E! Network.
This is in New York.
She owned a shop in East Hampton, New York, and that was probably my first exposure to kind of at least a certain type of cooking. But I was actually one of her bakers and pastry chefs, and I would be making bread and chocolate cakes and different sorts of pies, and pies for Thanksgiving. And how would I describe her cuisine? I would describe it as easy, approachable, light summer American, right? Was what I would call it. So she was kind of a successor in some ways to Martha Stewart, right? But her big thing was on entertainment, right, and entertaining guests, and how to put together a meal and an ambiance for a meal, right, such that it was festive and people relaxed and had a good time. But because it was East Hampton, which is kind of more of a summer community, at least the things I associate with her are more summery, more light, right, more for entertaining. And when you get 12 people together, how do you take care of them in a way that doesn't mean you have to be spending and slaving in the kitchen, right, while you're trying to take care of your guests, right? So
wow.
Yeah.
So after your cooking,
that was in between college and grad school. So really, for 10 years, I was cooking, right? I did that.
Did you enjoy
New York. I did. I had a knack for it, and it's probably a career that I could have gone on and continued to do, but in the end. My son was born. I was actually living in Montana, near Bozeman, Montana.
So you were already married then?
I was already married.
So after you finished college,
yep.
Did you get married right away?
No. I moved to San Francisco, where I also was cooking in San Francisco. So after...
With the same woman?
I left Ina Garten and the Barefoot Contessa, and I worked for another really good chef named Joyce Goldstein.
But you got married just before you, did you just say
No,
that?
no, no. I met my wife in San Francisco.
So you went, what made you decide to go to the West Coast from the East Coast?
I think that probably the biggest motivation was my a couple of college roommates from University of Chicago were out on the West Coast, one working for University of San Francisco as a researcher, I think another doing journalism, and then I wanted to join them and hang out with my roommates again from college.
So they were sending you letters and stuff saying, "Hey, man, you're missing out.
You should come out to San Francisco." Right? So yeah, so it was a good. That was really all I needed to to get out there. So I lived in San Francisco for 4 years, where I met my wife, and where I also kind of continued on the kind of culinary journey that I had started in New York. Right?
Okay. And then after that, then you decided to go back to school?
And then after my culinary journey was over, this is now 10 years post college with a 6-year stint in Montana mixed into that. Then I went back to graduate school and got my MBA and completely changed courses from a career perspective.
What made you decide to do that?
So I had a son, right? And
was your wife working?
My wife was working. And she worked as I went to graduate school as well. But I had a son. We loved it. We loved Montana. I could go back there. I hope to retire there at some point, or at least spend a few months a year. But it was time. It was finally time to say, okay, I've kind of had my fun. I was able to do a lot of skiing. I was able to do a lot of fly fishing. I was able to do a lot of things that I enjoyed doing. Really? Now I've got a family. I've got to take care of them, and I've got to put this education to work.
Where'd you get that outdoor feel from being? You were in New York, so I'm assuming you were more city than you were country.
Yeah, I grew up in the city and was really used to Manhattan and big city environments. On the other hand, I would say that even in New York, I was always either attracted by the beach or attracted by something that was not urban, right? So whenever I had a chance to get out to the beach or get out to Long Island or get to someplace outside of the city, I would typically take it. So I always had a little bit of a get out of the city feeling. And I guess too, if you grew up in New York City, in particular, there can be a certain insularity about New York City and New Yorkers, right? Which basically says, well, New York is the universe, right? And it's the only universe that I really need.
Did you have that? Did you have that?
There was a time, and I still believe that New York is one of the best cities in the world. But I had always also recognized that there were a lot of other places in the world that certainly deserved attention, and that I'd like to see, like where we are now in Tokyo.
So now you finish, you come back, you get your MBA in political science.
I got my undergraduate degree is in political science. I got my MBA with a focus on, of all things, statistics and operations research and a lot of quantitative stuff. Right.
Okay. And then when did you get your job? I mean, then did you start with EY right away?
Right out of graduate school, I went into consulting. So I worked for a boutique consulting shop based in Florida, based just outside of Tampa, that actually was doing consulting for big restaurant companies. Right. So actually, there was a connection because I had spent the last 10 years in restaurants and cooking and food and beverage, and so I knew that world and that universe quite well. But this company was doing pricing research and pricing recommendations at the time for maybe half of the largest U.S. restaurant chains in North America. So if I were to name them, you'd know a lot of the client base. But they were using, and we were using, analytic methodologies and analytic techniques like elasticities and cross-elasticities and this and that to be able to give pricing recommendations to restaurant companies for this burger should be priced this way, this fountain beverage should be priced this way, here should be the relationship in between your burger and your combo price.
Would this require you to give many presentations?
Of course.
You had to do all this presentation. So what your mother told you to do came into use.
Yes,
you really needed that.
You really needed it. So yes, I mean
was the company teaching you how to do this, or did they expect you to learn as on the job training?
I think a lot of it is both on the job training and then seeing I had some senior colleagues at the firm that I work with who I noticed how they did their work. I noticed how they interacted with clients. I noticed how they, answered questions, and learned a lot from how many of my colleagues who were a little bit more senior to me did and managed that, and learned a lot from that as well. So
what about, okay, now going in, there's butterflies and just being in front of other people. I've heard before that the average person out there, I've heard a couple of things. One is the average person out there would rather die, face death, than to stand in front of people and speak. And one other thing I've heard is that when you're speaking, everyone else out there watching you is just happy that it's not them. That's another way to look at it.
Yeah, there are a lot of people for whom public speaking and doing public speaking is a real.
So how was it for you?
As I was coming out of my initial cooking career and into graduate school, where there was a lot of teamwork and a lot of presentations, it took me a little while to get used to it, right? However, once I kind of finished grad school and started doing it, I very rarely felt fear or trepidation or nervousness about doing it. It's
okay. Give us your secret. What do you tell yourself when you're going out there to speak with people? Because it is, especially when it's possible sell or not a sell because of what you have to say, which could affect you in one way or another.
Well,
and how large are these groups you're talking to?
It could be anywhere from a meeting of senior executives of a dozen to 24 people, right? Which would be a kind of medium to average size meeting, or it could be giving a presentation on pricing and restaurants and food and beverage for a few hundred people in an auditorium or something greater, right? So it all just depended on the context, and I've done I guess I've done them all. Is there any secret to it? The first thing is know your subject, right? And if you know your subject and you're really, really good at your subject, then everything else goes.
What about your audience?
Everything else goes much easier. And then, of course, knowing your audience, right, is as important perhaps as knowing your subject. And I guess the way that I think about public presentations and a lot of public speaking is you've got to be able to explain things such that your mother or your grandmother, who may not know anything about the subject that you're describing, would be able to listen to it, hear it, and say, I get that, right? And if you've been able to do that, especially for larger groups of people, then you've done your job, right? So it's a combination of both knowing your subject matter, then obviously knowing your audience, and then having both confidence and facility with words to be able to simplify very, very difficult concepts and make them relatable, right, to people who aren't necessarily deep in these sorts of subjects. So,
Erik, tell me one time when you were speaking when you felt like you knocked it out of the park. It could be small or big group. One
of my clients was a large cosmetics and beauty company that was headquartered out of New York City on Central Park West. And I was invited to speak at a board meeting, and at the time we were presenting our forecast for the beauty industry, right, for the next 3 to 5 years. And the forecast itself was actually kind of challenged, right, to be able to come up with, and our estimates were a lot higher than what the consensus estimates for where beauty would be in the future, right? And so people would say, beauty's only been growing at 3 or 4% for the last 10 years. How is it possible that you're saying it's going to grow at 7% or 8% or 9%? But we were confident in our numbers, right, and confident at least in the results. And as you can imagine, I'm talking to a lot of beauty executives who have forgotten more about the industry than I'll ever know. Faced a fair amount of skepticism for it, but at a minimum, I was proud of the fact that we were both cogent, persuasive, laid out the argument for why we thought it was going to grow the way that it did, and ultimately, and I didn't know this at the time, were proved right? And so our forecast, and it's hard to say what's going to happen 5 years from now, right? But our forecast was remarkably accurate and durable, right? So that was both a presentation and then a piece of work that I was that I was particularly proud of.
How old were you at that time? Do you remember your age?
Oh gosh, early 40s, late 30s. Something.
You had your son already?
Yeah, I had my son on.
And what state? Where were you? What state were you in?
At that time, I would have been living in Florida, but as I recall, this presentation was in New York.
Okay. So where do we find you today? I know you're with EY today. Are you enjoying your work?
I do. Enjoy my work at EY. I enjoy the work that I'm doing in consulting more broadly. This is just kind of an exciting time to be doing analytics and analytics-related work, which is kind of the heritage of my career. But we've all been a part of this analytics revolution for the last 20 years, where 20 years ago we were, talking quite happily about, correlation and, simple regression models and, how to use models for decision making, et cetera, and to watch the evolution of what analytics was 20-ish years ago to generative AI today, right? Where it's obviously highly, I don't know if you've used ChatGPT or other AI platforms, but it's highly interactive, human feeling, and these large language models are giving you both content, right, and ideas in a similar way that humans process and deliver information. Is earth-shattering, right? In some ways. So no, I'm very much enjoying that sort of work and how it kind of applies to a lot of the clients that I work with today.
That is fantastic. Listen, Erik, before I end the podcast, there's a question I like to ask all of the people I have on an episode. If you could magically go back in time and meet the younger Erik and give him advice, how old would he be? And what advice would you give him?
I would go back to the Erik in my early 40s, who at the time was doing a lot of triathlons, right? So I was doing a lot of triathlons, like swim, bike, run. And at the time, it was easy for me to run 30 to 40 miles a week, and I was doing 30 to 40 miles a week just in training and in preparation for these triathlons. I would tell him to stop running, right? And I'd say, hold off on your running. Save your knees, save your back, save your ankles. Because as much as I enjoyed triathlon, as much as I enjoyed the running at the time, I'm now approaching 55. I'm still in good health and good fitness, but there's certain things that I know were very much caused by running, right? And I wish I could go back and say, Erik, give up the running and go do something else and do something that's going to be a little easier on your body when you get older. So that's one thing I'd say, just from a pure fitness perspective. And maybe the other thing I might also tell myself is, I think maybe I probably spent 3 to 5 more years longer in restaurants and food and beverage than I probably could or should have, right? So I think I probably would advise myself to have gone back to graduate school a few years sooner than I did. But we make the decisions we make. Life is good, and we're lucky enough to live in Tokyo and have great, meaningful, rich lives here. So things have worked out pretty well.
Thank you so much, Erik.
Thank you. It was great. It was great being here.
I want to thank all of you for watching this podcast. Make sure you press like and subscribe. And never forget, it's all unknown, so continue to reach for the stars.
Because you're too blessed to be stressed.